Welcome to News from Neptune for the third week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence today. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society is today one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and in China notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a coup edition of News from Neptune. As the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow, by coups, the elected presidents of Venezuela and the United States, as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance, secured by violence, of the U.S. 1%. The U.S. political establishment and their servant, mainstream media, continues purposely and mendaciously to use Trump as a distraction from the ongoing neoliberal and neoconservative policies that mean more war and increasing inequality in America. They ignore the burgeoning populist objection to those policies in this country and abroad. And an account of contemporary politics that ignores that fact seems to me, at the best, incomplete. You're watching News from Neptune today with a noted letter writer to the News Gazette as one of our speakers. They are attacking you in the News Gazette. Tomorrow's and tomorrow's and tomorrow's.
Tomorrow's, yes. Well, you know, that's the way
today at least.
I didn't know whether I would be happier if nobody responded to my letter arguing that the military has become, has always been, as I pointed out in my letter, subject to the class divisions in our society, but never more so since the end of the draft during the Vietnam era. And I pointed that out. I pointed out that we have a working class army that serves the interests of the neoliberal capitalist class, whether you want to call them the 10%, the 1%, or the 0.1%. And one of the local defenders of the faith, a man named who publishes often, both in commentaries and letters in the News Gazette, a fellow named Peter Tamaris, who is fairly well known around here for his, and especially for his conservative views. I call them conservative. It's kind of a silly word, really. He writes, among other things, he called me, what did he call me? Iconoclast. That's a pretty good word. I'll fess up to being that.
A lot of icons that need to be classed in?
Yes, right. And he wrote, quote, thousands of once disadvantaged men and women have been positively impacted by their valued service to their country. To many, our armed forces offer employable skills and self-confidence as alternatives to a life of poverty or crime. Here's the thing. A kid gets to be 18, and these are the choices that he or she has, whether to join the military or to countenance a life of poverty and crime. I mean, what's happened in those 18 years in our society that a young person is faced with such choices, not that everybody who enrolls in the military is. I think it's simply a sort of obviously career option that they are sort of lured into by their local, what do they call it, recruiter. Anyway, enough with that. It's kind of silly. He didn't make an argument he didn't counter any of my arguments about the nature of our wars and who benefits from those wars. And that's what's so telling about it. But I'm glad that somebody wrote. I'm glad that people can see how the other side of many sides presents itself, as opposed to the way I presented myself. No big deal, nothing personal. The point is, what do people think? How do people think about these things when they read my letter and they read his letter? That's what I care about, whether most people read my letter and say, yeah, that makes some sense, or whether people get their hackles up and say, he can't say that. Well, the future of our country and our planet to a certain extent actually depends on how people come to understand these things.
David, what do you make of the fact that the administration is trumpeting the employment figures, such as they are from recent weeks, really?
Yeah.
It shows jobs, a number of jobs in America being up, employment being burgeoning in the U.S.
Yeah.
Unemployment figures are statistically similar to what they have been, but the notion is that many people are entering the workforce who before had left it and therefore weren't counted as unemployed. The notion is, what the government is arguing, is that the policies, whatever they are, of this government are producing jobs. The sort of economic draft that you refer to, the fact that young people looking for opportunities find those opportunities in the military because there aren't opportunities elsewhere, that doesn't seem to be happening, right?
Yeah, there's always controversy about economic data, and I don't really know if I can clear it up all that much. The fundamental percentage of, say, the prime working age group, which they usually define as 25 to 54, the ratio of the people in that group working to the population in that group, I think is still below where it was in like 2008. So it hasn't gotten back to where we were before the Great Recession.
I think there's another aspect of this that has been summarized in part with the phrase "the gig economy."
Yes.
That the jobs that are available right now are less and less attractive jobs. The ability to find the sort of job that people coming out of school in the last generation found seems to have disappeared. The jobs are the result of American policies of austerity that suggest those jobs and the benefits as well aren't comparable to what existed before, in part because what existed before the neoliberal takeover of the American government a generation or more ago, those jobs had benefits and so forth that contemporary jobs don't. This is true, I think, in general. It's also true in terms of the actual compensation for jobs, even when they are available. Wages in America have been essentially flat since the early 1970s, and how striking that is noticeable at some level to people of an older generation who watched the burgeoning of the American economy into the 1970s, from the end of the Second World War into the 1970s, and saw that flatten out beginning in the 1970s. That's indeed what we mean by neoliberalism, the stressing of the the stress on return to capital, return to money, taken out of the potential wages of the majority. The notion that the productivity of American labor, which continues to rise, and has risen continuously since the end of the Second World War, should be compensated with rising wages. That went away in the 1970s, and that wasn't an accident. That was exactly what the neoliberalism was about, the policies of American business in the 1970s that said, look, we're going to take over the benefits of the productivity of American capitalism. We had to distribute that to Americans after the war in order to keep them quiet, basically, to maintain the 1950s atmosphere of expansion for all Americans, or after all, what were we fighting for? But that fundamental change in that, the coming of neoliberalism in the 1970s, characterizes our politics ever since, and is recognized at an experiential level by Americans. And the source of the populist wave in America right now depends upon that intuitive recognition of what the situation is.
Sometimes there's controversies. There's sort of wonky controversies over, for instance, the gig economy in terms of how it's defined and what it is and whether it's growing. And people I respect. First of all, Dean Baker looks at the Bureau of Labor data and says that temporary labor really hasn't grown as a segment of our workforce. But the gig economy, that temporary labor doesn't necessarily include Uber drivers. It doesn't include somebody who's working a job and driving Uber on the side, or just driving Uber. And that's a gig economy. It's an economy without benefits. It's an exploitative of its workers. And as you mentioned, there's not going to be any benefits. There's going to be you may say, well, Uber workers can choose their hours, but in other capacities, Starbucks workers, or there are workers who are told on a day-to-day basis what hours they are going to be working. So the nature of and have to adapt to that, even if it means sleeping in their car so they can be at not going home and sleeping in their car so they can be at work. So there's all kinds of things going on, which obviously makes work precarious, whether you define it in gig terms or not, or in temporary terms or not, including the lack of benefits, including the lack of health care, and the lack of people knowing what their retirement is going to be like beyond Social Security, which they want to take away from them also, of course.
And the thing that we don't, I think, generally admit is that the Make America Great Again movement had much more to do with this characteristic of American society at the current moment than with fantasies about racism or even war. What people voted for Trump for, in many cases, was to restore that notion of an economy that they saw their parents enjoying. And it took a long time for the recognition that economy had gone to actually move into voting behavior. But I think it did, and the political establishment is at pains to try to pretend to us that it wasn't this recognition that led to Trump's election, but it was rather racism or misogyny or something of that sort. That's the great suppressed argument in contemporary politics, I think, and it's very important.
But still, I mean, what I've been thinking about and what I've been noticing lately in the discourse on what people still call the left is that there's a couple different ways of handling Trump and what's happened with Donald Trump. One is to say it was just fascism or racism or what you just referred to, and then there's this kind of there's a more subtle, nuanced way of saying that, well, it isn't that Donald Trump came out of nowhere, and it isn't that people voted for him were we're all racist, but Trump is symptomatic of what was going on. And you could interpret symptomatic in various ways, but they don't go as far as to say they're saying what some people are saying when they're using that argument is that they're saying Trump is pre-fascist. He's on the way to fascism, as opposed to the fact that he stands for anything alternative to what neoliberalism is. And of course, one has a hard time seeing what the alternative to neoliberalism is that is contained within the policies that we've seen in the last 2 years. So there is that murky aspect of what all the discourse is, as opposed to just focusing on what it was people thought they were voting for, what it is they perceive that has been going on, what they thought they were voting for, what they would like to see, like universal health care or free college, and then talking about how we would get those things, regardless of, the whole pre-fascist thing or whatever just doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me. I don't know.
I think it's a tribute to your insight that it doesn't. You're watching news from Neptune.
Not that Trump has done anything to move us away from, or not that he's been able to do anything to move us away from these neoliberal policies of the last 40 years.
I think the frenzied opposition to Trump and the construction of what is beginning very much to look like an American coup against the president grows out of the great fear by the American establishment that these neoliberal and neoconservative policies have been followed quite closely by all recent administrations, are in danger from Trump, even though, as you suggest, he hasn't really done anything that suggests those policies are in any trouble at all, so to speak, from this administration. But the establishment fears that and knows how important that is, and therefore is willing to do a lot of things against the constitutional tradition of the United States, indeed, in order to make sure that those oppositions to neolib and neocon policies don't occur as a result of this administration's activity. One of the ways in which this is being worked out right now is quite remarkable discussion of who the appropriate candidates are, particularly among the Democrats, especially among the Democrats, for the 2020 presidential election. Prepare yourselves for all sorts of bad puns about 2020 vision and so forth, which will be with us probably for the next 5 years.
We're duly warned.
Exactly. One of the more interesting figures to emerge from this discussion is the congressional representative from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard. There's an article in Jacobin, the left liberal magazine, by...
What do you mean, the socialist magazine? Well, come on.
I've been criticized for not being clear about what I mean by socialist when I say it for a while, and I'm not entirely sure I want to call Jacobin a socialist magazine, but perhaps I can.
We can argue about that sometime.
The word's up for grabs, so to speak.
Yeah.
A fellow called Branko Marcetic has written in Jacobin, yes, Tulsi Gabbard opposed the Iran deal. That is the Obama administration's attempt to reincorporate Iran into the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger called it, that let the U.S. control energy flows from the Persian Gulf. This was seen as a liberal development and one that the Trump administration withdrew from. The notion that this supposedly leftish, even socialist, presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, actually opposed that Obama good idea is the hook for this article in Jacobin. To quote the article, In 2014, Gabbard called Iran, quote, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, close quote. By contrast, a year later, when asked about the potential for Saudi Arabia to develop nuclear weapons in response to a potential Iranian nuclear arsenal, she said it was understandable because Iran was right on their doorstep, Saudi Arabia's. Bear in mind that Saudi Arabia has been connected in varying degrees to terrorists over the past few decades, including through its involvement in the September 11th attacks, while Iran is both encircled by one nuclear power at the same time as its chief regional adversary, that is Israel, also secretly owns as many as hundreds of nukes, close quote. So the notion here that this fiery liberal spirit, Gabbard from Hawaii, is in fact down with the worst aspects of American foreign policy, was in the point of the article, and it wasn't wrong. I mean, Gabbard, there's a lot of room, so to speak, to be on the left in American foreign policy, and that includes the ability to take what look like retrograde views such as these. As our researcher Jeff Nicholson says, I'm quoting his notes here, we know she's down with the drone war, and he quotes an interview with Gabbard from The Intercept. Jeremy Scahill, interviewing Gabbard, says, I'm wondering what your position, I know that in the past you said that you favor a small footprint approach with strike forces and limited use of weaponized drones. Is that still the delightful activity of the Obama administration, followed on by the Trump administration? Scahill asked Gabbard, is that still your position that you think, to the extent that you believe the U.S. military should be used around the world for counterterrorism, is that still your position? Gabbard replied, well, when we're dealing with the unconventional threat of terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and some of these other groups that are affiliated with them, we should not be using basically what has been and continues to be the current policy of these mass mobilizations of troops, these long occupations and trillions of dollars going in, really abusing the authorization to use military force and taking action that expands far beyond the legal limitation of those current AUMFs. She's referring to the congressional authorization for war that followed 9/11. So with these terrorist cells, for example, says Gabbard, yes, I do still believe that the right approach to take is these quick strike forces, surgical strikes in and out, very quickly, no long-term deployment, no long-term occupation, to be able to get rid of the threat that exists and then get out, and the very limited use of drones in those situations where our military is not able to get in without creating an unacceptable level of risk, and where you can make sure that you're not causing, a large amount of civilian casualty, close quote.
Yeah,
well, I'm reading it verbatim.
Yeah, I know. I know. Those lives,
That's right.
Just people's lives.
Well, Jeff Nicholson,
civilian casualties. That's like we were talking dead people. Okay.
Who was producing this this material, notes that quick strike forces, surgical strikes, in and out, are propaganda terms. Remember when we were assured the invasion of Iraq would be speedy? And that, of course, is the background of this talk. Donald Rumsfeld, you remember him, said at the outset of the American invasion of Iraq, quote, 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months, but it certainly isn't going to last any longer than that. It won't be World War III, said Rumsfeld, that as the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. Drone attacks mean extrajudicial murder. Drone, including of Americans and many non-combatants. Drone wars continue current U.S. policy set back in G.W. Bush's administration and escalated in every subsequent administration. If she were president, if Gabbard were president, there's no reason to believe she'd do anything differently. Handpicked the targets from dossiers, baseball cards, as Obama did, on a Tuesday afternoon meeting. Terror Tuesdays, as the Obama White House called it, resulted in killing a lot of other people who just happened to be in the blast zone. Now, this critique of Gabbard is not unjust, but it does point out that how certainly the much abused word today, the most progressive candidate among the Democrats on foreign policy is still mired in American war policy. And I certainly would be very happy if before the 2020 election we actually talk about the wars that all recent administrations up to and including the current one have been carrying on around the world, and there really is a candidate who opposes them. It's not clear that Gabbard is, although she has corrected, you might say, some of the things that she said in this interview with the Intercept.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm so dissatisfied with this idea that we've been moving to the right, and Obama was moving to the right. Clinton moved the Democratic Party to the right. Then you had Bush, then you had Obama moving the Democratic Party farther to the right. Then Trump kind of hatched out of that into his pre-fascist form, so it's going to keep moving right. But the point is, and I've excerpted the first line of a column by the quote-unquote conservative New York Times columnist Bret Stephens called the Rudderless West, just to show how this just doesn't work. Because here, somebody who now, as we move to the right, represents a kind of centrist, what's called a centrist point of view, meaning he's against Trump and against what Trump is doing in terms of foreign policy. He begins his column, The Rudderless West. You know where he's going with that. In August 1990, George H.W. Bush met Margaret Thatcher in Aspen right after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. The pair resolved not to allow Iraq's naked aggression, which he puts in quotes, to stand. And it did not. This was how the West, capital W, West, was supposed to work, and how sometimes it did. And then he spends the rest of the column, lamenting how far down the West has come in being able to behave like the quote-unquote capital W West is supposed to. But when you think about Kuwait, you think about 1990, August of 1990, which inspired you to start this program, I think. What we're talking about is the United States invading, given after the United States had supported Saddam Hussein against Iran from 1980 to 88 in that miserable, awful war, killing over 1 million people. After that, we invaded Kuwait and then sanctioned Iraq in the 1990s. What is fascism? What distinguishes Hitler from Donald Trump? Hitler wanted to invade other countries. Donald Trump doesn't seem to he hasn't, except for Syria, supposedly, hasn't really pulled anybody out of other countries, but at least he has said he wants to, or he did say he would. And so what is a fascist? Bret Stephens is a fascist, okay? The New York Times editorial columnists are fascists if they support controlling the world by force, which is what the West is supposed to be doing.
There's one way, pardon me, one way to look at this is to notice that the policies of historic fascism as practiced by Germany and Italy in the early 20th century, which is where the name comes from, most people are not aware of the source of the name, but it has to do with the illustration of unity in ancient Rome, where the fasces were the collection of sticks with an axe in the middle bound up together, and the illustration was supposed to be how much stronger they were together as opposed to individually, each stick being able to be broken, but together they represented strength. So fascism was a matter of national unity, enforced national unity, in order to carry on an aggressive foreign policy. That's where fascism came from in the first place. Now, to use that term from those different historical circumstances to apply to contemporary debates seems to me to be almost always counterproductive. It leads to misunderstanding rather than understanding. Fascism is not a positive term in contemporary discussion, except for some fringe elements here and there. It's a negative term in that it's a term that you use to apply to your enemies. Oh, you're a fascist. That's fascist talk. You're moving more and more towards fascism. It's relatively useless in this regard because of its lack of historic specificity and the ability of terms like that to hide the real debate that's going on in American foreign policy, and indeed in the foreign policies of other states as well. The U.S. foreign policy is actually remarkably consistent over generations. What the U.S. is trying to do in the world at large can be reduced brutally, literally and figuratively, to the notion that the U.S. is using military force and economic dominance to maintain the profits of the 1%. That's been true of American foreign policy for more than a century. And the object of much concern of American foreign policy has been Eurasia, Russia and China. If you think that that is being too modern, go back and read about the debates about the open door policy at the end of the 19th century. American policy has been from the beginning that no power, domestic or foreign, should organize, integrate the Eurasian economy in such a way as to prevent the American 1% from exploiting it. And that remains the heart of what the U.S. is doing, although the tactics may change. The tactics that lead an Obama administration to do a nuke deal had little to do with nuclear weapons, a great deal to do with oil, with Iran. May be replaced with tactics that reject that deal, but the overall goal remains the same, remains what it's always been in American foreign policy. And what we need to understand today is what the U.S. is doing is in pursuit of that policy, and the reason the rest of the world fears the United States government is that the rest of the world knows that the U.S. government, the agents of the American 1%, will do almost anything, up to and including threats and indeed perhaps the practice of nuclear war, in order to maintain those profits. When the rest of the world looks at the U.S. that way, it's very difficult to argue that the issue is fascism, unless you understand what the U.S. is doing. The overall American foreign policy is itself fascist.
Yeah, I want to recommend in passing three different two-part interviews that the Real News had in the general area of the world and foreign policy and so forth. One is a couple of interviews with a prominent Canadian leftist named Yves Engler, Y-V-E-S, Engler, talking about Canada's loyalty to U.S. foreign policy and to U.S. wars. And one thing I kind of found interesting that I hadn't really known too much about was the alleged reputation that Canada's Prime Minister in the 1960s, Lester Pearson, had for being a relatively enlightened person, which is debunked in this interview, especially regarding Lester Pearson's support for the Vietnam War and Noam Chomsky's criticism of Pearson during that time. The second set of two interviews, I mean, all these two interview sets probably total maybe 20 to 25 minutes. The two interviews combined like 20, 25 minutes. One about also Israel, in which I think one of the best commentators on Israel is included Shir Hever, as well as a very good Israeli analyst, David Sheen. And Shir Hever had his usual pointed comment to make. He speaks from Germany, where he's a graduate student, and he talks about the Israeli elections, the parliamentary Knesset Israeli elections coming up in a few months. And basically he says this, after David Sheen analyzed the various parties and the various movements, what Shir Hever said was this about the Israeli elections and the Israeli population. He said, I think they're predictable, and I think the Israeli public has already decided. The Israeli public decided not to decide, to just leave the status quo of apartheid and occupation in place forever. And now the ball is in the court of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are the ones who are going to decide their futures. So whether we're looking at one state or two states or whatever, it's not going to be a decision taken in Israel. It's going to be a decision taken by the Palestinians. And both of those interviews are worth watching. And then finally, and I think probably you have some comments to make about this, Carl, a two-part interview that was done with Leo Pan about Brexit and about what's going on in the British ruling class right now. One of the interviews was Leo Panitch, who's from Canada, but has had associates in the British Labour Party and is very authoritative about what's going on over there, as well as a fellow named John Landsman, who is an official and one of Corbyn's associates in the Labour Party. And what Leo Panitch has to say about this is regarding the current debate over Brexit and what's going on. He goes, they are completely refusing to recognize reality. It's unbelievable. There's no way that there will be a separation between Europe and the UK and the EU after 50 years of all kinds of integration. Judicial, legal, even departmental structures are heavily integrated, let alone trade, investment, etc. There is no way that is going to happen through a hard Brexit. There will be negotiations that will stretch on for years over this. And then Panitch goes on, the otherworldly notion, which is really driven, as I say, by xenophobia, is simply not credible. So what is going on here then is the refusal to accept that negotiations will continue for a considerable period of time. And of course, there is the question of Northern Ireland. Then it is delicious for someone who knows the history of the Tory party to see them all writhing as they are over there. The division of Ireland, it was British Tories who divided Ireland and led to, between the Protestants and Catholics, the Catholic South and the majority Protestant North, and led to the terrible history of the 20th century in Ireland. So to see them writhing now over this one is one of the greatest ironies, and is probably the main reason that this deal didn't go through.
I hesitate to disagree with Leo Panitch on this. The notion that the deal will not go through certainly is defensible, with the notion that with the sense that the relations between Britain and the European Union, the economic relations, will maintain in some form. And its argument about that form, that Brexit, which means the British exit from Europe, is really about. An exit, a hermetic seal between Britain and Europe along the English Channel is not going to happen. That's certainly true. So what we're talking about, as he quite rightly points out, is what the status of that relationship is. There's a very interesting article by Richard Tuck, a British lawyer and now teaches at the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square. And Richard Tuck, that's Chomsky's phrase, Richard Tuck points out that Marx early on observed that constitutionalism was finally a way for the ruling class to keep power. If you set up a constitutional system, then that system will maintain the structures of power that exist when it's established and make them all the more difficult to confront. That's certainly true in the history of the United States, although we don't normally teach it that way. But Tuck's concern is that the European Union provides, as it were, a constitution for Britain, for the United Kingdom, which does not, in fact, have a written constitution, as the U.S. does, and that what the argument about Brexit, about exiting from the European Union, is really about in Britain, is about the ability of Britain to establish various forms of economic progressivism against the constitutional requirements of the European Union. That is to say that in order to make socialism in Britain, you've got to get out of the European Union. Now that, I think, is brutally true, and that's the reason that there are so many left voices, or a number at least of left voices, saying that, of course, Brexit is the right idea. But obviously, as you're suggesting, the question is how it's done. What's going to happen with that? And that's, of course, what is exercising British politics very much these days. It's the general question of how the populist demands, which are sweeping the capitalist world, demands that are inchoate and unclear and in many cases contradictory, they're the demands that brought us Trump, after all, will be worked out in this particular matter of the UK's relationship to the EU, to the European Union. The jury's out. It is possible if that there may be a good outcome, an outcome that will lead in the direction of economic progressivism against the neoliberal austerity programs that have been imposed by the European Union over the last generation and more, and what the move to a Brexit really is finally about. It's rejecting austerity, it's rejecting European neoliberalism that animates finally the move towards separation in Britain. But the matter is extremely unclear, and as we see from the daily headlines, and it's not at all, and it's certainly not obvious where it's going to go. We can say the same thing about some other countries, right?
Yeah, most of them, I would think, except Greenland, which it's already clear where it's going to go.
Yeah, the extinction, I think, right?
Yeah. Or Tuvalu.
I see. Okay.
Anyway, shouldn't joke about climate change, I suppose. It's on my mind a lot. I've been reading a lot, trying to, read a lot. There's a lot about the Green New Deal going on. Some of it helpful, some of it not so helpful. I would recommend. There seems to be a debate that I would at least refer to for anybody who's interested. There was a debate between Dean Baker and a fellow named Jason Hickel, who I know of and who I've thought of as a very good commentator, on whether we can have, of whether the Green New Deal should be pro-growth or anti-growth. And it's kind of complicated how they define growth. It isn't always clear how they define growth, but I think it is a productive debate to a certain extent. Another respected liberal left economist, Robert Pollin, who actually wrote an article in the New Left Review last summer about the Green New Deal, comes down on the sort of the pro-growth side, saying we can still have a certain kind of growth and the Green New Deal, in other words, deal with climate change. And then there's a fellow, Stan Cox, who has an article, I think, at the top of the Counterpunch yesterday, Thursday, in which he talks about his more or less anti-growth views. So I think at least these are the things that we should be thinking about in terms of what the relationship is between programs that address climate change and programs that address capitalism. I think that these are, one fellow, I'm going to take a shot here at Jeffrey St. Clair, because I think he's not doing a very good job these days, although Stan Cox was fine. He allowed a fellow named Andrew Stewart to put up 3 articles about his idea of the Green Party's Green New Deal. And I think they're lousy. And I think he puts it in terms of intersectional feminist politics, which is kind of silly. And I'm not sure why Jeffrey is behaving this way. But we could probably talk about this over beers afterwards.
It's interesting to see how this phrase has developed and transmogrified over the times. The New Deal, after all, as I mentioned earlier in another context, refers to those policies that were forced upon a Democratic administration in America in the 1930s in order to deal with a real crisis. That is the collapse of the American economic order, the Great Depression. Something had to be done, and things that really did help people, things that really did alleviate the exploitation of the American working class, which of course is what the American economy is based on. Those things had to take place. And that New Deal tradition lasted through the Second World War and down into the generation afterwards, the 30 glorious years, as Piketty called it, the rebuilding of the victorious countries in the years after the Second World War. That was the New Deal. That was the phrase that was seized upon to refer to a Green New Deal, that is a series of necessary economic and social reforms to deal with the environmental crisis, to deal with the with climate catastrophe, as it's more accurately perhaps described these days. The Green New Deal then was a phrase coined by the Green Party, the Environmental Party, to refer to a combination of programs that took on what has been called the greatest crisis of humanity, that is, the destruction of the ecology of the planet. Now it's been adopted, stolen one might say, by some Democrats who say they perhaps have a Green New Deal as well, a series of reforms that will deal with the environmental crisis. I think this should probably have more to do with the history of marketing than the history of the economy, but that may be cynical. The idea of a Green New Deal is a very interesting idea, and we can't say that any American political party, with the possible exception of the Greens, have taken it at all seriously. But the Democrats are now using the term. Yeah. Can they be allowed to get away with that, David?
Absolutely not. And we won't have it. But let me just refer. Dean Baker's blog is called Beat the Press. It's at the CEPR.net website. And Robert Pollin's New Left Review article from last summer may not be available to some who don't have access to the university library, but we can figure out how to get it up, how to put it up on the
Facebook page.
Yeah, we can put it on the Facebook page. We have our ways, and just. I mean, the only other thing actually, I didn't think I would get to cover most of what was on my list, but I gotta have a shout out to the UTLA, United Teachers of Los Angeles.
Absolutely.
Which is, I think their strike is being well covered. On Jacobin, there's an article called Billionaires versus LA Schools. The situation in California isn't quite that simple, or in LA isn't quite that simple. And I think even the New York Times has been covering it fairly well. And then there's been daily updates on Counterpunch from one of the members of the teachers union named Glenn Sachs. So maybe a relative of mine. I don't know. Uh-huh. And anyway, that was my mother's maternal, my mother's, what do you call it? Her name before she got married.
Family name.
Anyway,
right?
Anyway. So there's a lot to say about California, and there isn't time, so maybe put up next week. But I have a whole rant about California and what happened to it and how it got into this position. But just to say, I mean, last week we talked about Delaware being neoliberal, you know, ground zero. Well, California is probably a better argument for California. If you exclude Wall Street, I guess, there's a better argument for California being neoliberal ground zero. I mean, that's where Ronald Reagan came from. That's where Michael Milken came from. So that's where Proposition 13 came from. So there's a lot going on there that prepared the ground for what's gone in public education in California and public education everywhere and neoliberalism everywhere. It's a big topic.
You may know that in the history of English literature, particularly, indeed European literature in general, west is the direction of death. That's where the sun goes down. The idea that economic death should come to us from California has at least a spiritual progeny, I guess, or a spiritual ancestry.
There's a certain irony in that because, you know, the whole idea of California was that people thought they were going to live, you know, forever. So yes. I guess it didn't turn out that way.
And they didn't mean zombies either.
No.
You mentioned a moment ago the very important news channel, the Real News Network, which you can get online in various forms. An organization put together by a man called Paul Jay about 5 or 10 years ago. They have done remarkable and important things that are not being done in American mainstream media. They had one of the more interesting commentators on Russiagate in a man called Aaron Maté, who also worked for a while for Democracy Now! Maté has just left the Real News Network for reasons that are a bit obscure. It would seem that the political views he was talking about in regard to Russiagate were compatible with what the Real News has done. Our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, writes, "The most I've been able to make of the disagreement between the Real News and Aaron Maté is that Paul Jay, the founder of Real News, dismisses Russiagate as minor, making Russiagate goings-on something he can safely ignore or marginalize. This means he isn't too keen on having a stream of Russiagate debunking stories from Maté, but he's not going to support the Russiagate narrative either." Jay, from the Real News Network, is cagey about clearly revealing his thought on this. The most I've seen is Jay talking with Real News host Mark Steiner, who believes and defends Russiagate tales, despite any evidence, pushes identity politics to attempt to explain why poor Americans are suffering, and Darman Noor, who seems to believe that, quote, apparent interference of Russia in the election of 2016. Instead of clearly addressing the consistency of Russiagate stories crumbling on examination, which I certainly think they do, the dearth of relevant evidence is to back the idea that Russia somehow put Trump in office, or the principle that freedom of speech means that even Russians will say things some people don't want to see. Jay spent time dwelling on side issues. One, what he calls prettifying Putin, making Putin look better. How Putin runs Russia is not really part of the Russiagate controversy as it's being used in American politics. Two, the savage attack of the Trump administration on the people is not relevant because we're discussing an issue that predated and ostensibly explained the 2016 U.S. election. That is, the collusion, supposedly, that meant that Americans, instead of electing whom they were supposed to, elected Donald Trump. Three, explaining away the assumed black and white thinking that leads to one having to say things like, now I don't defend the Iran administration, when one is about to either say something non-critical or supportive of Iran. There's a lot of word salad from Jay, from the Real News Network, according to our researcher. Meanwhile, for some time, Jay had discussions with Maté and many reports from Maté clearly debunking Russiagate stories and clarifying Russiagate defenders like Marcy Wheeler and James Risen, who was absolutely mad, including an interview with Risen where he hung up on Mattei. Risen writes for The Intercept, and the notion of The Intercept is Risen spends most of the things he writes for The Intercept these days calling Trump a traitor who was put in place by Russia, the standard Russiagate line. Since the Real News Network gets their funding from donors, and since I don't assume Jay is a fool, it makes me wonder if the Real News Network is facing the same funding issue I believe Democracy Now! Is facing. Both get funding from people or organizations that essentially tell them not to make the Democrats look bad. And one way to do it is to eliminate the sharpest critics of Russiagate, like Aaron Mattei. Well, I don't know whether our researcher is right about this, but it has a plausibility to it.
I was wondering, I've been wondering the same thing, and I hadn't read that, what he just wrote, of course, but I mean, first of all, he went, for better or worse, he went to work at the Nation, where Aaron Mattei is working now, and perhaps has more of a chance to devote himself specifically to various projects one at a time, as opposed to juggling all the stuff and maybe making more money for doing it. I don't know.
It's a surprise, given that the Nation has been, how shall I say it, accommodationist Democrat in its politics for a long time.
But still, they've got Stephen Cohen, who is anti-Russian Gate and married to the publisher. So it's complicated.
There's your explanation.
It's complicated. Yeah, it's always a lot could be, could be explained by who's sleeping with whom. But still the young people, the young gaggle of people that are associated with each other on various podcasts, Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, Ronnie Akalik, Aaron Mattei, all seem to be still doing what they're doing. Ben Norton is on The Real News now. So there's still that aspect of it. So I don't know how all these things are working, but I think Paul J. claims that he's running The Real News in this kind of loose way and depending only on viewer contributions, not corporate. So I don't know about the issue that he's under pressure from any funders. I'm not real. I would be skeptical of that.
The Nation, the Real News Network, and our friends at Counterpunch.
Counterpunch is a different story. Boy, they've got some issues now. But
and we're happy to, if that's the word, to ventilate those issues. They are still three sources that are strikingly at odds with the American mainstream media right now, and therefore should be paid attention to, even when we disagree with them. You've been watching News from Neptune for the third week of 2019. A coup edition, and we didn't even mention Venezuela, which of course is one of the coups that I had in mind. A coup edition as the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow, by coups, the elected presidents of Venezuela and the U.S., as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%.
Just one line. There's a nice interview that Max Blumenthal did with Steve Elner on their podcast, Moderate Rebels, about Venezuela. So that's a good reference.
Pay attention to Venezuela. Mainstream media doesn't.
Yep.
News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scolleray. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.